Welcome to the Berkshires Gone By, history and folklore about the westernmost and most beautiful county in Massachusetts. I'm your host, Brooke. The Fosburgh family sat in the courtroom, waiting. It seemed that everyone in the audience held their breath. The moment it took for the judge to walk to his podium was like an eternity, and the fate of lives hung in the space between. There were two sides to the story: the defendants, the Fosburgh family themselves, and the prosecution, the state. The family said one thing had happened, and the state theorized another. But in the end, one thing remained the same, and unchangeable. 23-year-old May Fosburgh was dead. So who was May, and what had happened to her? May Fosburgh was born in St. Louis, Missouri, in 1876, to parents Robert and Esther, who'd both been born in Canada. They'd had 3 other children as well: a son, who was 5 years older than May, named Robert like his father, but they called him Bertie, and another son, who was a little over 2 years younger, called James. Later on, she'd have a much younger sister, 10 years her junior, named Beatrice. The family moved around a bit, as Robert's jobs moved, but before coming to the Berkshires they'd been living in Buffalo, New York. Robert had spent some time manufacturing saws, but started a new company as a building contractor with his son Bertie, with the plan of including his younger son once he came of age. R.L. Fosburgh and Sons did well, affording the family a comfortable life, and they'd just gotten a contract to expand the growing G.E. Stanley factories in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. The money was worth the move, so they took up residence in the stately house at the corner of Woodlawn and Tyler Streets. It was a large Victorian, and the family, which now included Bertie's wife Amy, settled in. At 23 years old, May was already considered a spinster, beyond her marrying years. She had, in other terms, missed the boat. As a 35-year-old woman who would love to get married someday but just hasn't had that sort of luck, I admit to taking offense at that. A sort of old-timey nostalgic offense that doesn't actually make any sense in modern times. But enough about me. On the night of the event, the house was rather full, as usual. Her father, mother, brothers, sister, her brother Bertie's young wife, Amy, as well as her sister's friend, Bertha Sheldon, age 16, who was visiting, were all in that evening. Before bed they had spent some time together, and May had sung a song, "The Plains of Peace," before they made their way to bed. The father of the family, Robert, said that that evening went like this. In the early hours of the 20th of August of 1900, Esther, May's mother, awoke to a sound, so she woke up her husband to see what it was. But before he could even reach the open doorway to the hall, there they were, 2 masked men, and he recognized the fabric of the masks as being from the family's own pillowcases. He'd nearly run into one of them, and Robert and he began to struggle. It wasn't long before the second masked man hit Robert over the head, and Robert was out like a light. The commotion awoke others in the house. May hurried down the hall, with her little sister Beatrice close beside. Bertie came out into the hall just in time to see one of the intruders turn and shoot May in the heart from several feet away. He said that he was just able to reach her as she collapsed, and was able to lower her gently to the floor. The 2 men, the robbery plans ruined, ran for it, Bertie making chase. They managed to escape from a second-story window, and fled into the night. This was when Robert finally regained consciousness, and found a scene formed of his sobbing wife knelt over his dead daughter. The people who lived next door knew the Fosburghs. In fact, James Shepherdson worked for Robert as a secretary. He, his wife, and 2 others staying with them were awoken by what sounded like a loud fight. They heard a bang, and then all grew still. Worried, Fred Lund and James Shepherdson wait a while, keeping an eye on the still house, before finally gaining the courage to venture next door, leaving James's wife and guest Mabel Chapin peering out of the window at the darkness. James Fosburgh, whose bedroom was on the 1st floor, had been sent by his father to the Stanley Works across the way to use the phone to call for help. James Shepherdson and Fred Lund found James Fosburgh hurrying from the house. As he rushed by them, he told them that his sister had been hurt badly, so the two men went together to fetch a doctor. James Fosburgh did call the police and told them about his sister before running back home. People from around the house in all directions began to emerge from the darkness to see what had happened. A patrolman arrived on the scene, attracted by the commotion. Patrolman Chapman knocked on the door. Robert answered the door and told him that his daughter had been shot, but then asked the officer to wait there, where he was. Just after that, the doctor came up and knocked on the door. Robert opened it again and told the man the same thing. Robert claimed that the women were terribly distraught and needed a moment before the two men were allowed to enter and disturb his daughter's body. A half-hour passed before they were finally let in, but of course, nothing could be done. May was dead. So that was Robert's story, and he was sticking to it. John Nicholson was chief of police of Pittsfield at the time, and was the one who got the call and sounded the fire alarm, which attracted people from far and wide. Most people arriving expected to see a fire that would need to be fought, but instead, they were met with a story of murder and killers on the loose, killers that would need to be found and brought to justice. Guns were gathered, many from the nearby Pearson's Hardware, and men hurried to block every road out of town and comb every backyard and vacant lot. It was probably the only night ever that every homeless person in town had a roof over their heads, as they were all rounded up and brought to the police station. But they were all found to have nothing to do with the case, and were let go. Mobs of men searched for the next few days, almost all of North County. Governor Crane offered, and the city offered, rewards that added to $3,000, a huge sum at the time. To put this into perspective, a school teacher made about $340 a year around 1900. They didn't find much, and what they did find was all near the house: some scattered clothing and a gun, a .44. Reporters far and wide loved all of it. The story became more and more lurid, and poor May's description became fairer. Her age became younger. People were spellbound by the mystery. It was only a few months into the year of 1900, and the papers were already shouting that this was indeed the crime of the century. But something wasn't sitting right with Chief Nicholson. Something didn't seem right at all. There were those that speculated that this incident may have been related to a recent and somewhat similar break-in in Springfield. Also, once a week, the pay for the employees of Robert Fosburgh was brought from the bank and kept in the home for one night before being handed out to his workers the next day. Perhaps someone had recognized that security weakness and decided to take advantage of it. But Chief Nicholson didn't like those theories either. They didn't seem to add up, not when looked upon with a mind conscious of other clues. First of all, the gun they'd found, the .44, was a dead end. It was shown that the bullet that had killed May was fired from a .22. Funny thing, the shopkeepers at Pearson's Hardware said that her own brother had bought a .22 only weeks before. They'd also found a pair of trousers outside the house that belonged to Bertie, and a shoe owned by his father. And the neighbors said that they hadn't only heard shouts and a shot, like Robert had claimed, the ones that he claimed had attracted the neighbors. Instead, they themselves claimed that they had heard a loud and lingering argument much earlier in the evening, and then later, at night, the shouting and the shot. Two different fights. And why was Amy, Bertie's wife's, nightgown torn, and their bed broken? And why was it that the neighbors witnessed that the time between the shot and the time between James leaving the house to call the police was an entire half-hour? And then another half-hour passed, as the doctor and the policeman were told to wait at the door. Why was it that when James called the police, he told them not that there were burglars, but only that his sister May had been seriously hurt? And why was it that someone that could have been a witness to the identity of the burglars, Bertha Sheldon, who had been visiting that night, had been packed up and shipped off before even being able to say a word to anyone about that evening? The family couldn't even agree to how many burglars there had been. Bertie said that he had come into the hall. He saw his two sisters there, and 3 burglars, one of whom shot May. Robert said that he had seen 2, one of which had grappled with him and the other that had knocked him out. Beatrice said that she hadn't seen any at all, but said that she had come into the hall later and seen her sister dead. Both her father and her brother, however, claimed that Beatrice had been there the moment her sister was shot. Robert said that he had called to James and told him to go ring for help. James said that in fact it was Amy who had woken him, shouting that his father had gone mad, that he hadn't heard a shot until just after Amy had woken him up. In the attic, through which it was claimed the thieves had entered, none of the dust or cobwebs had been disturbed at all, and the window it was claimed that they had fled by didn't even open far enough to let a human adult through. Bertie had claimed that as he had chased the burglars out, one of them turned before climbing out of that window and fired back at him. That would mean that the bullet holes would have been in an interior wall, as of course the burglar missed. However, bullet holes were found around the window on the exterior wall, which simply didn't make any sense. And as far as I was able to find, no one seems to remember hearing any other shots being fired. Chief Nicholson couldn't seem to shake his hunch, so after much investigation, he arrested Bertie. Chief Nicholson's idea of what happened that night went something like this. Bertie wanted more control over the family's money and the running of the business. Bertie was also known to lose his temper very easily. Chief Nicholson believed that Bertie was drinking, had either come home drunk or had become that way at home, that he had argued with his father. This was the first fight that the neighbors had heard. Then the family calmed down. May sang her song, and then they all went to bed. But Bertie lay awake for a while, the disagreement simmering in his sleepless mind, until it came to full boil. His wife, may have tried to stop him, but he shoved her away as he grabbed for his gun. She might well have tried to pull the firearm from his hand. This could have been when her gown was ripped, and their bed broken, as she could have been thrown upon it, or against it. Bertie stormed into the hall. Amy watched as father confronted son in the doorway of the parents' room, and a struggle began. This is when Amy darted downstairs and woke James, crying out that his father had gone crazy, a statement that wouldn't have made much sense if burglars were in the house, but made much more sense if her father-in-law was now partaking in a battle with her husband. During this struggle, Bertie's mother may have tried to break up the row, for she had acquired a bruise on her face that she refused to discuss later. Obviously, she hadn't been successful in stopping the fight, for it may have been about that time that Beatrice and May entered the scene, coming to see what the noise was about, and then the gun discharged, killing May at close range. The powder burns showed that the shot had been fired close to her body, not from down the hall, like the family claimed. Bertie might well have caught her and lowered her to the floor, because if he had shot her, he would have been close enough, and that might have been the big scuffle the neighbors heard a while after the first, and that might have been the shock it took to end the family fight and suddenly pull them back together, intent upon saving themselves. Bertha, the friend who had been visiting, must have remained in the girl's room. Perhaps it was not suitable for a guest to see a family squabble. But when Beatrice returned to the bedroom, she told Bertha that burglars had been there and shot May. Bertha was quickly packed up and ushered out the door. They may have scrambled to come up with a story, and then to lay the scene by planting fake evidence of a break-in. After half an hour, when the people next door had mustered enough courage to come knocking, they were asked to wait a bit longer. And then, when the doctor and the policeman had come knocking, they were asked to wait just a little longer. And then finally, when the stage had all been set, and after they'd all gotten dressed, imagine your sister, your daughter, having just been killed, taking the time to dress before letting help into the house. They finally opened the door and played their parts. Too bad none of them seemed any good at remembering the script, especially not Beatrice. Poor young Beatrice, whose story seemed to change every time she told it. Chief Nicholson thought the case looked pretty convincing, and Bertie was charged with manslaughter. Reporters and the simply curious flooded the city, many staying in the once struggling Wendell Hotel, which once stood at the corners of West and South Streets. This sudden flood of guests saved this hotel from bankruptcy. Rumors ran wild. The local trend seemed to believe that Bertie had killed his sister and that the family had covered it up. But the story was published all over the nation, and in the rest of the country, the census was quite the opposite. Reporters from far away tended to write the local authorities as though they were bumbling idiots who couldn't find a knob on a door, let alone murderers on the run. This trial was one of the first to use forensics, but this didn't impress Judge William Stevens. Despite all of the experts brought to the stand to attest to the scientific facts to support Chief Nicholson's theory, the DA, at the time dying, even made the effort to travel to be able to testify for the prosecution, only to pass away shortly after. Yet, to the judge it didn't matter. The trial only lasted 8 days. Judge Stevens had had enough. He told the jury to acquit Bertie. Before all of this, the Fosburghs seemed on the outside like a well-mannered, well-off family. And other well-off families found it hard not to pity them. This may well have included the judge himself. It seemed to the judge that the evidence produced by the prosecution was only circumstantial and speculation. Bertie was said to have bought a gun, but where was it after all? Even if the bullet in his sister was from a .22, and he had bought a .22, it proved nothing. Only that the burglar owned one as well. The window didn't open that far? Well, that simply meant that the burglars were slim. They had managed to get away after a search of half the county. Simply meant that they were sneaky. The dust hadn't been disturbed. Only meant that they were careful. The family couldn't keep their story straight. Only meant that they were under extreme stress. And upon Judge Stevens' decision, the audience gathered, cheered. The family hadn't been staying in the house. Instead, they'd been staying in the Wendell Hotel, across from the courthouse. You know, the same place that all the reporters from out of town had been staying. Those same reporters who sympathized with them. So after the trial, everyone returned there, and a full-scale party was thrown. The very next morning, soon as the sun rose, the family left. Most stopped at the coast of Massachusetts, at Nahant, then went to Maynard. All but Bertie and his wife. They took off for Canada. May was buried in the Bronx, in Woodlawn Cemetery. Years later on, her parents would join her there. One man did turn himself in after his girlfriend claimed that he was the burglar/murderer. He was William Lewis Gray, but he told authorities that he was just trying to pretend that he was a tough guy for his girl, Olive. She'd often give him money and other items to help him out of these fictional jams he'd get himself into. So he, being the shady fool he was, began making up these stories regularly, sometimes associating himself with actual stories in the papers. But he'd gone too far this time. He wasn't just stringing her along for money anymore. He'd unintentionally gotten himself in trouble for something he didn't do. His story of making up stories rang true. He wasn't the killer. Time passed, and memory of the murder faded into history. But the house May died in stood proudly there on Tyler Street. No Fosburgh ever returned to it, or to the city. It was later converted into apartments, but no one really wanted to live there. Ghost stories abounded about the grand old house. It wasn't well kept, and in 1950, in a sad, shabby state, it was sold, leveled, and replaced with a Sun Oil gas station. And the neighborhood seemed relieved. One thing I feel I should include. In 1909, Amy, Bertie's wife, sued her husband for a divorce. It seems he liked to beat her. Just more evidence of Bertie's short temper. On a side note, a funny thing happened to me during the making of this episode. I discovered that a book has just come out on this very topic. It's called Pittsfield Fosburgh Murder Mystery by Frank J. Leskovitz. So if you'd like to learn even more about this baffling case, you can buy this book. I know I'm going to. This has been The Berkshires Gone By. Created, written, directed, and read by myself, Brooke Grenier, and co-produced by Deanna Garner. You can find more episodes on YouTube or at www.youtube.com/BrookeGrenier. theberkshiresgoneby.com. There are also photographs there related to each episode. Photographs and episodes can also be found on our Facebook page. We hope you'll join us for our next episode. Thanks for listening.